Summer, 1974. A small Texas town. Inside an aging theater, the smell of cigarettes and spilled beer hangs heavy in the air. Locals crowd into the creaking seats, restless, waiting for their turn to be entertained. Onto the stage walks a thin 19-year-old with nothing but a battered acoustic guitar. His palms sweat, his fingers tremble. Yet he dares to sing the one song that changed his life, Elvis Presley's "Can't Help Falling in Love." At first, silence. A fragile breath of possibility. Then the whispers begin. A laugh from the back row. A cruel shout, "You'll never be Elvis!" The noise builds, mockery, whistles, stomping feet. His voice wavers, but he clings to the melody. The boy doesn't know it yet, but behind the curtain stands someone who shouldn't even be there. Someone who has felt the sting of ridicule himself. Someone whose presence will shatter the night and change it forever. What happens next is a story no one in that theater would ever forget. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The boy had never stood before such a crowd. Until now, his voice had echoed only in bars with sticky floors and half-empty stools, where men drowned their wages in cheap whiskey and barely noticed him strumming in the corner. But tonight was different. The old town theater, with its cracked red seats and ceiling lamps that hummed with age, had filled with far more people than he'd ever faced. He could feel the weight of their eyes before he even stepped into the light. His father was a factory hand, a man whose hands smelled of oil and steel, whose back had bent under decades of work. His mother worked small jobs, laundry, sewing for neighbors, whatever could bring a few extra dollars into the house. Music had been the boy's refuge from that quiet suffocation. Years earlier, when the family barely had enough to pay rent, his mother had brought home a record she found at a church fair. A worn vinyl with Elvis Presley's face staring back in faded colors. She told him, almost whispering, "Listen to this, son. This is a man who came from nothing too." That record became a secret world. He played it until the grooves thinned, memorizing every crackle and every line of the songs. He learned the way Presley's voice carried both strength and tenderness, like a prayer and a rebellion woven together. When his father came home silent and weary, when bills piled up on the kitchen table, the boy slipped into his room, pressed his ear close to the spinning vinyl, and felt as if someone out there understood. And now, years later, he had chosen to honor that memory. He would sing one of Elvis's songs tonight, not out of imitation, but because it had been the spark that lit his own fire. He wanted to show his mother that all those nights of whispering encouragement were not wasted. Backstage, his palms sweated so much that he wiped them on his trousers until the fabric darkened with damp spots. The guitar strap slid against his shoulder, slick with nerves. His fingers trembled against the strings as if the instrument itself resisted his touch. He could hear the low murmur of the audience, the shuffle of feet, an occasional cough echoing in the hall. Each sound was magnified in his skull, making his chest tighten. The stage manager, a tired man with a cigarette stuck to his lip, gave him a half-hearted nod. The curtain creaked as it pulled aside, and a beam of harsh yellow light struck him squarely in the face. The brightness blurred the crowd into a shapeless shadowed mass, yet he felt the prickle of their scrutiny as if each pair of eyes was a blade. He stepped forward. His boots scraped against the wood. The microphone groaned with static when he touched it. That small screech made someone in the crowd laugh, and the sound stabbed him more sharply than any insult. He gripped the guitar tighter. His throat was dry as cotton. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He told himself, "You've done this before. You've sung in bars. You've sung in alleys. You can do this now." But the scale of it, the sheer size of the room, twisted his confidence into knots. He looked down at his knuckles, pale from how hard he clutched the neck of the guitar. A voice from the back broke the murmur. "Come on, kid, let's hear it already." Laughter followed. Another voice chimed in with something cruder, earning a few whistles. His stomach churned. He wanted to disappear behind the curtain, back into the safety of obscurity. But then he pictured his mother's face, the way she had once held the Elvis record like it was a treasure. She had told him, "Don't waste your voice hiding, son. It's worth more than you think." That memory steadied him. He leaned toward the microphone, the metal cold against his lips. For a moment, silence hung, stretched tight, the whole room waiting. The light above buzzed, a faint halo of dust swirling in its glow. The boy inhaled deeply, his chest lifting with both fear and defiance. Then he struck the first chord. The sound rang out raw, imperfect, but real. His voice followed, shaky at first, then steadier, reaching into the dark where faces waited. Yet even as the melody began to flow, he sensed a resistance in the air, as if the crowd was more eager to judge than to listen. A cough, a rustle of impatience, a faint chuckle near the front row. Still, he pressed on, pouring himself into the song that had once saved him. He imagined his mother sitting somewhere in the shadows, her hands clasped, her heart in her throat. He imagined his father, though less expressive, secretly proud that his son had dared to step onto this stage at all. The boy's voice rose, carried by the old theater's acoustics, filling the space where so many doubted him. Every tremor of his hands, every drop of sweat sliding down his temple, seemed to charge the air with fragile determination. This was his night. Whether he triumphed or fell, he had chosen to face it head-on. And as the last note of the opening verse trembled out into the hall, the room held its breath for a fraction of a second, before the storm would break. The first chord had barely faded when the silence broke. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing but the boy's trembling voice hanging in the air, raw and earnest. Then, from somewhere in the center rows, a short laugh burst out, sharp, mocking. Others picked it up like sparks leaping to dry tinder. What began as scattered giggles quickly swelled into a wave of derision that rolled toward the stage. He pushed harder into the second line of the song, tightening his throat to force the sound out, but the laughter grew louder, mixing with whistles and sarcastic shouts. Someone shouted, "You call that singing?" A roar of approval followed from nearby seats, the way crowds love to cheer cruelty when it smells blood. His fingers fumbled on the guitar strings. The wrong chord rang out, metallic and sour. The noise ignited a fresh round of jeers. A plastic cup arced through the light, spinning slowly, catching the glow before it smacked against the stage and bounced to his feet. The liquid inside spread across the wood, glistening like a stain of contempt. The boy froze for a moment, staring at it. His chest heaved, as though the theater air had grown too heavy to breathe. He tried to keep singing, clinging to the melody, as if it were a lifeline, but his voice cracked. The note broke, jagged and painful, and the hall erupted with howls of laughter. Near the back, he caught sight of a face that stood out. A man, older than him by maybe 10 years, sat forward in his seat, clapping his hands in slow, exaggerated rhythm. The grin on his face wasn't amusement. It was malice. His lips moved, whispering something to those around him, and soon they joined in with more shouts, louder this time, more organized. The boy realized with a sick twist in his stomach, this wasn't just spontaneous mockery. Someone was feeding the fire. His mind flashed to his mother's voice again, the quiet insistence she repeated whenever doubt crept in. "Don't you ever give them the satisfaction of seeing you quit." He wanted to cling to that, to let it shield him, but the sound of the crowd drowned it out. Dozens of faces were visible now in the dim light, twisted with amusement, mouths wide in ridicule. He searched desperately for even one pair of kind eyes, but all he found were smirks and sneers. His heart pounded so violently that he thought it might burst through his ribs. His palms slickened on the guitar until he almost lost his grip entirely. The microphone swayed slightly, picking up the chaos of the hall. Whistles, stomping feet, a chant beginning somewhere to his left, mocking the words of the song. He pressed his lips together and tried again, his voice breaking on the next note, thin and uneven. The humiliation bit deeper with every second. He saw a group of young men in the front row cupping their hands to their mouths, pretending to cry like babies, mocking his trembling tone. One of them spat toward the stage, and though it didn't reach him, the gesture stung worse than if it had landed. Somewhere in the wings, he could hear the muffled voices of the organizers, debating whether to cut the microphone. The tension on stage was unbearable, like standing in a spotlight that burned hotter with every jeer. The boy's thoughts spun wildly. He remembered the nights when the factory whistle blew, and his father trudged home, shoulders sagging, saying nothing, just collapsing into a chair. He remembered how his mother would put that battered Presley record on the turntable to soften the silence, telling him stories about how even Elvis had started out with nothing, with people doubting him every step. He clung to that memory, but here and now, it felt like those words had no defense against the roar of the crowd. The theater floor vibrated as people stomped their feet, some shouting for him to leave the stage. The man in the back, the one orchestrating the cruelty, cupped his hands and yelled, "Go home, kid." His voice cut through everything else, and the laughter swelled again. The boy felt a hot sting at the corners of his eyes. He blinked furiously, refusing to let tears fall under the glare of the lights. His throat closed in on itself, strangling the next line of the song before it could even form. His chest tightened, his stomach knotted, and he felt the first crack in his will. He glanced down at the guitar, once a source of comfort, now a dead weight strapped to his body. The strings blurred under his vision. He strummed one last time, but the sound was swallowed by the storm of jeers. He could no longer hear himself, no longer feel the rhythm. All he felt was the crushing shame of standing alone before a sea of hostility. The laughter echoed in his skull, louder than the music had ever been. He wanted to scream, to smash the guitar, to run. Instead, he stood frozen, his voice lost, his hands trembling so violently that the pick slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the stage. The sound was tiny, almost invisible beneath the uproar, but to him it was the final blow. He looked out into the blur of faces one last time. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were judges, executioners, every cruel word he'd ever feared given flesh. In their eyes, he was already defeated. The humiliation was unbearable. He staggered back a step, his breath shallow, his body taut with the urge to flee. The noise pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, relentless. He realized, with a hollow ache, that the dream he had clung to so fiercely had never felt further away. And with the jeers still raining down, the boy made his decision. He turned, almost stumbling, and headed toward the shadows of the curtain, the sound of ridicule chasing him like a storm he could not escape. The curtain fell behind him like a heavy door slamming shut. Out front, the crowd's jeers still thundered, muffled now, but no less cruel. Backstage, everything was dimmer, quieter. The stale smell of sawdust and old curtains thick in the air. The boy stumbled across the uneven floorboards and dropped onto an overturned wooden crate. His guitar slid down beside him with a hollow thud. He buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, though no sound came out. He wasn't going to let them hear him cry, not even back here, where the shadows wrapped him in secrecy. The laughter still echoed in his skull, circling endlessly. Every stomp, every whistle, every mocking cry clung to him like burrs he couldn't shake loose. He pressed his palms harder against his eyes until sparks of light burst behind his lids. He wanted the world to vanish, if only for a minute. The theater smelled of dust and faintly of sweat, of machinery working somewhere far away. The backstage bulb flickered, throwing brief, weak light that stretched his silhouette across the wall. And then, a voice. Low, steady, deep enough to silence the storm in his head. "You sang one of mine." The boy's head jerked up. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it, some trick of his exhausted mind. The voice was familiar, almost too familiar, like a memory speaking aloud. In the dim light, a figure stood a few paces away. Not flashy, not radiant, nothing like the posters plastered in record stores, just a tall man in a dark jacket, a pair of black sunglasses catching the faint glow from the bulb. His hair, still jet black though touched by time, framed a face the boy had seen 1,000 times on old record sleeves. It couldn't be. The boy blinked hard, but the figure didn't vanish. The man stepped forward, slow, unhurried. His presence seemed to bend the silence around him, commanding without a word. The boy's heart stuttered in his chest. "Elvis!" The name slipped out before he could stop it, barely more than a whisper. The man inclined his head slightly, as though confirming it without ceremony. His voice carried the drawl of Memphis, familiar yet impossible in this forgotten theater. The boy scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over the crate. I didn't mean... I thought..." His words tangled uselessly. He felt absurd, small, broken, standing before the very man whose music had lifted him through years of struggle. Elvis didn't rush to fill the silence. He leaned against the wall, folding his arms, watching the boy with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't judgment. Something quieter, something steadier. "You picked a hard crowd," Elvis said finally. His tone was calm, but not detached. It carried a weight of experience, the kind that could only come from someone who had been on both sides of adoration. The boy swallowed hard. His throat still ached from the song that had torn itself out of him. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Why are you here? How is this real? What do you think of me? But all he managed was, "I shouldn't have sung it. I thought I could..." His voice broke again, not from strain this time, but from shame. Elvis pushed away from the wall and took a slow step closer. Even in the half-light, his presence filled the cramped space. "You sang it honest," he said. "That's more than most do." The boy shook his head, wiping his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "They hated it. They hated me." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Elvis's mouth, not mocking, but almost rueful. "You think I don't know what that feels like? Let me tell you, son. First time I got up in Memphis, some folks didn't clap. They laughed. They wanted me gone before I even started. Thought I was some kid pretending to be something I wasn't." He paused, his voice softening. "You don't forget a sound like that. Cuts right down to the bone." The boy's breath caught. The idea that Elvis Presley, the man whose records filled stadiums, and lit up radios across America had once stood where he stood now, drowning under jeers, was almost impossible to grasp. "You keep thinking it means you don't belong," Elvis went on, his words deliberate, careful. "But it's the opposite. Means you've started to matter enough for them to push back. Nobody boos someone they don't notice." The boy stared at him, chest still heaving. His mind whirled between disbelief and the fragile ember of hope the words sparked. Behind them, the muffled roar of the theater continued. But back here, in this narrow stretch of shadow and dust, time felt suspended. The boy saw not the icon from posters, but a man, lines carved at the edges of his eyes, carrying the weight of years on the road, triumphs and mistakes alike. The silence stretched again, softer this time. The boy felt the sting of his humiliation dull slightly, replaced by a strange, trembling awe. He wasn't sure whether to bow, to thank him, or to fall back onto the crate in disbelief. Elvis adjusted his sunglasses, tilting his head toward the noise still rolling from beyond the curtain. "World out there's loud tonight," he said quietly. "But don't mistake noise for truth." The boy let out a shaky breath. For the first time since stepping off stage, he felt something other than shame. An anchor, a glimmer of steadiness. He had no idea what would happen next, only that the night had shifted into something far larger than failure. Because in the silence after disgrace, a shadow had stepped forward, and it was Elvis Presley himself. The boy still stood frozen, caught between disbelief and the lingering sting of humiliation. The backstage air was heavy, the scent of aged curtains and stage dust pressing down on him. He could hear the muffled roar of the crowd beyond the wall, but it felt distant now, as if the world had shrunk to this narrow corridor and the figure standing a few feet away. Elvis didn't hurry. He rested one hand casually against the frame of a support beam, the other brushing the pocket of his jacket. His presence carried no fanfare, no grand entrance, and yet it seemed to command the space more than the entire theater out front. "You kept your voice steady longer than most would have," Elvis said at last. His tone was even, stripped of any condescension. "Took guts to stay on that stage as long as you did." The boy shook his head, shame burning fresh across his face. "It didn't sound like guts out there. It sounded like I was drowning. They didn't want me. I should have walked off sooner." Elvis tilted his head, the corner of his mouth tugging almost imperceptibly. "Walking off sooner doesn't stop the pain. Just makes it last longer in here." He tapped a finger gently against his chest. The boy dropped his gaze to the floor, the splintered planks blurred by the wetness in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, though even as he said it, the words felt wrong. A low chuckle rumbled from Elvis. Not cruel, more like the sound of someone recognizing a memory. "Don't I?" The boy looked up sharply. "I'll tell you something I don't talk about much," Elvis said. His voice lowered, each word deliberate, like stones placed carefully along a path. "Back in '54, I was just another boy from Memphis, with a second-hand guitar and a lot of nerves. I stepped up on a stage at the Overton Park Shell. Thought I was ready to take the world by storm." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, as though replaying it in his mind. "But the folks out front, they weren't listening the way I hoped. Some of them laughed. A few walked out before I even finished the second song. I could feel their judgment burning through me. And I thought, right there, maybe I wasn't cut out for any of it." The boy blinked. He had read stories about Elvis's rise, but they were always dressed in triumph, framed as destiny. To hear him speak of mockery and rejection, spoken in that slow, measured drawl, made it real in a way no magazine ever could. "What did you do?" the boy asked, his voice hoarse. Elvis let out a long breath. "I finished." Voice shaking, hands near useless. But I finished. Then I walked off with my head up, even though my insides were crawling. And you know what stuck with me? Not the booze, not the laughter. The one or two people who looked me in the eye after, like they'd seen something worth hearing. That was enough to keep me going. The boy's heart thudded unevenly. The image of Elvis, already a giant in his mind, standing small on a stage, uncertain, despised by some, felt like a revelation. "But you," Elvis continued, his gaze steady, "you sang one of my songs tonight. Not to copy me, not to put on a show. I heard you. You meant it. That's the only thing that matters. Doesn't matter if they spat, if they laughed. You sang it honest." The words sank into the boy like cool water after fire. Still, the ache of humiliation lingered, heavy and raw. But what if that's all they ever see in me? Just another fool to laugh at? Elvis stepped closer, the light catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. "Son, you can't measure yourself by the worst thing a crowd throws at you. If I'd believed the worst things said about me, I'd have quit before I ever made a record. Every stage, every song, it's a gamble. But you've got something most don't. You stood there when the whole room wanted you gone. That's courage, and courage counts for more than applause." The boy swallowed hard. His hands, still trembling from the performance, clenched into fists at his sides. For the first time all night, he felt a flicker of steadiness. Elvis leaned back slightly, his voice softening. "You think you failed tonight. But maybe tonight's the first step. Maybe the memory of this hurt will be what drives you to sing with more truth than any of them can ignore." The backstage bulb flickered again, sending shadows shifting across the walls. The boy thought of his mother, waiting out in that hostile crowd, hoping against hope for him. He thought of the vinyl she'd placed in his hands years ago, and how her voice had carried the same message Elvis was speaking now. Don't stop. Not when it's hardest. Elvis's words carved through the haze of shame. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, the boy lifted his chin. His chest still hurt, his pride still smarted. But something else stirred underneath. A stubborn ember refusing to die. He looked at Elvis, not as an untouchable idol, but as a man who had once walked the same brutal road. And in that recognition, the boy found something stronger than applause. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. Out in the theater, the storm hadn't settled. The jeers hadn't burned out with the boy's retreat. They had only shifted shape, restless, demanding. The crowd, half amused and half impatient, stamped their feet against the wooden floor, turning the old building into a hollow drum. A chant began somewhere near the back, drunken voices colliding in rhythmless noise. "Next! Next! Next!" The organizers, two men in wrinkled suits with nervous sweat shining under their collars, stood near the stage curtains whispering frantically. One of them waved his hands toward the lighting booth, trying to signal a cut. "We can't let this drag on," he hissed. "The crowd's going to tear the place apart." "They came for a show," the other replied, his voice tight. "If we don't give them something quick, they'll want their money back." Or worse, his eyes flicked toward the exit doors, where a few ushers already looked overwhelmed by the rising volume. The sound rolled in waves, mocking laughter, stamping, clapping that carried no rhythm, only derision. The smell of spilled beer drifted through the air as more cups were tossed toward the stage, bouncing against the boards with dull thuds. The spotlight, now glaring on an empty microphone stand, seemed to mock the organizers themselves. Backstage, the boy shrank deeper into the shadows. He pressed his back to the wall, the noise filtering through the curtains like knives. His chest ached from the humiliation, but worse was the certainty that the crowd's fury was growing, shifting from him to anyone who dared follow. His mother was still out there, he realized suddenly, swallowed by that restless mob. The thought made his stomach knot tighter. Elvis stood a few feet away, silent for a long moment. His head was slightly bowed, his sunglasses catching the faint bulb light. He could hear it all: the crowd's scorn, the panic of the men in suits, the fragile thread holding the night together ready to snap. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the tension with a calm that felt almost unnatural against the chaos. "They think the show's over." The boy looked at him, unsure if it was a statement or a question. "It is, isn't it?" His voice cracked with exhaustion. Elvis turned his head, studying the curtain, the faint outline of the stage glowing through the gap. "Not yet." The boy's breath caught. You're not thinking of—" Elvis straightened slowly, shoulders squaring as though he'd just made peace with something inevitable. "If you let them end it this way, son, they'll own the memory. Every time you walk on a stage, you'll hear them again. That can't be the last note of your night." The organizers noticed him then. Their whispered argument stopped cold. One of them squinted, blinking rapidly as though his eyes couldn't be trusted. "Is that—" His voice trailed off, strangled by disbelief. The other clutched his clipboard tighter, whispering furiously, "It can't be. What would he be doing here?" But Elvis ignored them. He took one slow step toward the curtain. The boy felt his knees weaken. The thought of Elvis Presley, legend, icon, the man who filled stadiums, walking onto that shabby stage for his sake was too much to comprehend. "You don't have to do this," the boy said, his voice urgent, almost pleading. Elvis glanced back, his mouth curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. "I've done a lot of things I didn't have to. But some things—" He paused, the smile fading into something steadier. "Some things you don't walk away from." The organizers scrambled forward, panic etched into their faces. "Mr. Presley, if that's really you, this isn't the place. The crowd's drunk. They're riled up. This isn't safe." Elvis cut them off with a single raised hand. He didn't need to shout. Authority radiated from him in quiet waves. The organizers faltered, glancing at one another, suddenly aware they stood in the presence of someone whose word carried more weight than theirs ever could. The boy could only watch, numb, as Elvis pushed the curtain aside just enough to glimpse the chaos beyond. The roar of the crowd surged instantly louder, spilling backstage like floodwater. The boy's breath stuck in his throat. For a brief instant, Elvis lingered there, one hand on the curtain, his silhouette framed against the spill of stage light. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the noise of the crowd took on a waiting quality, restless but expectant, as though sensing something about to change. Then Elvis stepped forward. The boy's vision blurred at the edges. His chest heaved, his knees weak with the weight of what he was witnessing. He wanted to call out, to stop him, to tell him it wasn't worth it. But no words came. On the other side of the curtain, the theater erupted, not yet with recognition, but with confusion, as the crowd saw a lone figure emerge into the light. The chant faltered, replaced by murmurs, questions, a ripple of uncertainty. Backstage, the boy gripped the edge of the crate until his knuckles whitened. He couldn't fathom it. Elvis Presley had chosen to walk into the storm that had broken him. And in that instant, he understood. This night wasn't over. It was only beginning. At first, the theater didn't understand what it was seeing. A man had walked onto the stage without fanfare, without announcement, moving with steady, unhurried steps. His silhouette cut sharply against the glare of the spotlight. But to most of the crowd, he was just another stranger, perhaps a stagehand sent to stall for time. The noise didn't stop immediately. A few hecklers booed reflexively, expecting the next performer or some apology from the organizers. But something about the way the man carried himself slowed the eruption. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't nervous. He moved as if the stage already belonged to him. He reached the microphone stand, adjusted it with one hand. The faint scrape of metal echoed through the hall. For a moment, the audience simply stared, their drunken chants caught in their throats. The man lowered his sunglasses slightly, just enough for the front rows to catch a glimpse of his face. And then the first shriek tore the air. A woman's voice, high-pitched, stunned. "Oh my God! It's him!" The recognition spread like wildfire. Gasps, cries, disbelief colliding with one another until the theater seemed to shudder. Some people leapt to their feet, others grabbed their neighbors, pointing toward the stage. The boos dissolved instantly, swallowed by a roar that was no longer cruel, but thunderous with awe. Elvis Presley stood at the microphone. The boy, still backstage, gripped the curtain with both hands, his mouth dry as dust. He watched the transformation unfold in seconds. The mob that had humiliated him now electrified, their faces turned upward, wide-eyed and fevered. He could hardly breathe as the sound of adoration shook the old theater to its foundations. Elvis lifted a hand, palm out, and the roar began to quiet, the way a storm sometimes softens at the command of the wind. His voice carried without strain, steady and deliberate. "You were ready to laugh this boy off the stage. But I tell you, he had more courage standing here tonight than most of you'll ever know." The hall froze. A silence heavier than the earlier mockery descended, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above. The boy felt the words strike through him like lightning. His legs nearly buckled. Elvis turned slightly, beckoning toward the wings. He sang because it mattered to him. And when a man sings from the heart, you ought to listen. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some of the same men who had been jeering earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman clasped her hands to her mouth, her eyes wet, as if ashamed by the laughter she had joined in minutes before. The boy hesitated. His instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to avoid the gaze of those who had ridiculed him. But Elvis's presence at the microphone seemed to pull him forward, as though the world itself had tilted in that direction. Before he could move, Elvis spoke again, his tone sharp but calm. "Courage deserves respect. Tonight, you'll give it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the drunks in the back, still clutching half-empty cups, said nothing. Then Elvis did something simple, yet devastating. He laid a hand on the microphone stand, turned slightly, and extended his other arm toward the curtain. His gaze swept the wings as though inviting the boy himself to step into the light. Backstage, the boy's throat clenched. He wanted to collapse, to sink into the floor and vanish. Yet, at the same time, a strange heat coursed through him, a trembling current of possibility. Elvis didn't rush. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he spoke again, softer this time, but the words carried to every corner of the hall. "This boy has a voice. You didn't hear it the first time because you weren't listening. You're going to hear it now." The boy staggered forward a step, still half hidden in the curtain's shadow. He saw the crowd lean, waiting. Fear wrapped tight around his chest, but when his eyes found Elvis, standing calm, steady, hand still extended. Something inside him loosened. The gesture wasn't grand, but it was enough. Elvis's presence turned the stage from a place of shame into a place of promise. The boy inhaled shakily. The laughter from earlier still echoed in his memory, but now another sound pressed against it. The hush of hundreds waiting, hushed not by mockery, but by expectation. And in that fragile space between fear and hope, the boy realized something extraordinary. His humiliation had not been the end. It had been the door. And Elvis Presley himself was holding it open. The boy's feet felt heavier than stone as he crossed the stage, each step carrying the weight of every jeer still echoing in his memory. The lights blinded him again, just as they had before. But this time the silence was different. It wasn't the stillness of ridicule waiting to pounce. It was charged, taut, as if the whole theater had leaned forward at once, breath held. Elvis stood at the microphone, steady as a mountain, his hand resting lightly on the stand. When the boy finally reached him, Elvis gave the smallest nod, not theatrical, not exaggerated, just enough to say, "You belong here now." The boy's hands trembled on the guitar, slick with sweat. He wanted to vanish, yet at the same time he felt the current of the moment pulling him further in, as though escape was no longer possible. Elvis bent closer, his voice low enough for only him to hear. "Don't think about them. Think about the song. Let it carry you." The boy's throat tightened, but he nodded. Elvis crouched briefly, picked up a second guitar that leaned against an amp at the side of the stage. With a casual grace, he sat on the edge of the platform, letting his legs dangle toward the first rows. The gesture was disarming, intimate. He wasn't towering above the crowd. He was sitting with them. He looked back up at the boy and spoke clearly enough for the audience to hear. "Go on. Start it. This is your moment. I'll follow when it's right." The boy swallowed hard. His fingers pressed the first chord. The sound rattled out, shaky, slightly sharp. For an instant, his old fear surged. What if they laughed again? But Elvis began to strum softly along, steadying the rhythm like a hand guiding a trembling child across a river. The boy opened his mouth and forced the first line out. His voice cracked, thin at the edges, but it didn't collapse. He clung to the melody, each word landing more firmly than the last. Then, halfway through the verse, Elvis's voice slid in beneath his. Not overwhelming, not dominating, just weaving into the boy's tone like thread into cloth. The two voices, one rough with nerves, the other seasoned and resonant, met and created something unexpected. Harmony. The crowd went still. Those who had mocked earlier now leaned in, caught off guard by the strange beauty of the duet. The old microphone hissed faintly with static, but it couldn't blunt the power of the sound. By the time they reached the chorus, the boy's voice no longer wavered. The presence beside him steadied his chest, widened his breath. Elvis didn't sing over him. He lifted him, each note layered, so the boy's voice shone brighter than before. A murmur spread through the hall, the kind that carried awe instead of ridicule. Someone near the back whispered, "Listen to him." Another voice shushed a drunk neighbor who had started to speak. The mocking energy had drained away, replaced by a fragile quiet, the kind that meant people were listening with their whole bodies. The boy dared to glance sideways. Elvis's face was calm, eyes half closed behind the sunglasses, mouth curved in the faintest smile as though he were enjoying himself rather than performing a rescue. That tiny expression pierced the boy deeper than any applause. It was as if Elvis believed he belonged here, and therefore he did. The song climbed toward its peak. The boy pushed his voice harder, higher, shaking, but unbroken. Elvis leaned in, joining him with full force now, the resonance of his tone filling the theater like a cathedral bell. The harmony cracked open the silence, and for the first time that night, the hall erupted, not in laughter, but in cheers that rose like thunder rolling across hills. The boy nearly faltered at the sound. He wasn't sure if his body could contain the surge of relief, of disbelief, of sheer electricity coursing through him. But Elvis nodded once more, firm, grounding him. So he kept singing. By the final chorus, the crowd was clapping in rhythm, voices crying out not in derision, but in encouragement. The boy's chest expanded with each breath, his voice fuller than he'd ever heard it. The shame from earlier was still there, but it had transformed, molten, fueling every note. When the last chord rang out, the silence that followed was vast, golden. And then it shattered beneath a wave of applause so fierce it rattled the seats, shook the rafters, spilled like a tidal surge across the theater. The boy stood trembling, unable to move, his guitar still slung awkwardly across his chest. He couldn't process it. Minutes ago, this same room had nearly destroyed him. Now, it lifted him higher than he'd ever dreamed. Elvis rose from the edge of the stage, set the guitar aside, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The gesture wasn't dramatic, wasn't a show for the crowd. It was quiet, almost fatherly. And in that simple touch, the boy felt something impossible to name: strength, belonging, a promise that he wasn't invisible anymore. The crowd's cheers rolled on, but for him, the moment was silent, intimate. He wasn't hearing the applause. He was hearing Elvis's words from backstage. "You sang it honest." And tonight, with Elvis beside him, he finally believed it. The last chord still lingered in the rafters when the audience began to rise. First in twos and threes, then in waves, until the whole theater seemed to lift itself to its feet. The same people who had hurled cups and jeers now clapped, until their palms must have burned. Their faces were flushed, not with cruelty this time, but with shame, with awe, with the bewildered joy of having witnessed something they hadn't expected. In the front row, a woman covered her face with both hands, shoulders trembling. The boy's eyes swept over her and then froze. He recognized her instantly. His aunt. She had slipped into the theater without telling him, perhaps out of curiosity or duty. And now she stood sobbing openly. The sight pierced him more deeply than any roar of applause. And others saw it too. People nearby turned, whispered, realized that the boy wasn't just a stranger fumbling through a song. He belonged to someone they knew. He was family, flesh and blood from their own streets. The theater shifted again, the atmosphere turning almost confessional. Some clapped harder as though to wash away their earlier cruelty. Others looked down, ashamed, faces red not from drink, but from conscience. Elvis still stood beside the boy, his hand steady on his shoulder. He didn't bow. He didn't soak in the applause the way the world had always expected him to. Instead, he raised the microphone once more, his voice carrying through the storm of hands and cheers like a bell cutting through fog. "Remember this," he said, his tone calm but heavy with weight. "Every artist you've ever admired, every one, started out with someone laughing at him. Everyone had nights when the world wanted him to quit. But the difference between the forgotten and the remembered is this: some keep singing anyway." The hall grew still again. Even the applause faltered into quiet, as though the crowd feared missing a single word. Elvis's sunglasses caught the glare of the lights, but his voice carried the intimacy of someone speaking one-to-one. "You may think tonight you were just watching a boy stumble. But I tell you, years from now, You'll remember that you saw him take his first step, and you'll wish you'd been kinder. The silence that followed was dense, almost unbearable. The boy felt it press against his skin, the truth of it settling in his chest like a stone. He looked out into the sea of faces, the same sea that had mocked him, now transfixed, subdued by words that cut deeper than any song. And then, almost as if to release themselves from the weight of guilt, the audience erupted again. Louder than before, cheers and whistles now mixed with cries of apology shouted from scattered voices. Some people waved their arms as if begging forgiveness through sheer noise. The boy's aunt reached toward him with trembling hands, mouthing words he couldn't hear, but felt all the same. His throat tightened. For a moment, he thought he might collapse under the intensity of it all. Elvis didn't let the noise carry him away. He leaned slightly toward the boy, his voice low enough for him alone. "Take this in, but don't let it blind you. A crowd changes its face quick. Remember who you sang for, yourself, and those who believed in you before tonight." The boy swallowed hard, nodding, his vision blurred with tears he no longer cared to hide. The theater around him thundered, but the only thing he truly heard was the man beside him reminding him what mattered. Elvis turned back to the microphone one final time. His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Kindness costs you nothing, but cruelty leaves a scar. A hush swept the hall again. No one dared laugh, no one dared sneer. The weight of their earlier mockery hung over them, and Elvis had handed it back to them to carry. The boy stood taller without realizing it. His shame hadn't vanished, but it had been reshaped. It was no longer something that chained him. It was something that fueled him, that marked the moment he had survived. The crowd continued to cheer, but beneath the cheers was something new: respect. For the first time that night, he felt it land on him, not borrowed from Elvis, but his own. And in that moment, he knew. Tonight was no longer the story of his humiliation. It was the story of his beginning. The roar of the crowd still reverberated through the walls long after the final note had died. Backstage, the boy's body felt weightless, as if the stage had drained every ounce of strength from him. His guitar still hung against his chest, but he barely noticed the strap digging into his shoulder. He wanted to speak, to pour out gratitude in 1,000 tangled words, but nothing formed. Elvis removed the guitar he had borrowed and leaned it carefully against the wall. His movements were unhurried, quiet, almost understated, as though what had just happened on stage was no more extraordinary than a casual rehearsal. For him, perhaps, it was. For the boy, it had been nothing short of salvation. "I don't know how to thank you," the boy finally managed, his voice hoarse. Elvis turned, expression unreadable behind the dark lenses, though the faint lift at the corner of his mouth carried warmth. "Don't thank me tonight. You'll thank me when you walk out on a bigger stage one day, and don't flinch." The boy's chest tightened. He wanted to protest, to insist he'd never be that man, that tonight had been a once-in-a-lifetime accident. But something in Elvis's tone, firm, unshaken, made it impossible to argue. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. The organizers appeared, flushed and anxious, but when they realized Elvis was still there, they froze, unsure whether to speak. Elvis offered them nothing but a polite nod before slipping past, his boots striking softly against the wooden floor. He didn't wait for praise or recognition. He simply moved, as though accustomed to vanishing after storms. The boy followed a step, but Elvis lifted a hand without turning. "Stay with your people. That's where you're needed tonight." The boy stopped, watched. Elvis disappeared through the side door, the faint creak of hinges opening to the humid night. A moment later, he glimpsed the glow of headlights outside, a black Cadillac waiting quietly in the alley. The engine hummed low, and just like that, the man who had turned humiliation into triumph was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the town. The boy stood frozen, the stillness pressing against him. The theater's chaos felt far away now, muffled by the heavy curtain. What lingered was the smell of dust, the faint throb of adrenaline, and the echo of Elvis's words. Don't mistake noise for truth. He drew a breath, bracing himself, and stepped back toward the hall. The crowd had dispersed into pockets, some still buzzing with disbelief, others subdued, as if haunted by their own cruelty. Ushers moved uncertainly through the aisles, and there, near the back, stood his mother. She hadn't clapped, she hadn't cheered. She had stood silently through it all, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on him. When their gazes met, she smiled, though her lips trembled. He moved toward her, the old guitar knocking softly against his side with each step. When he reached her, she wrapped him in her arms, the embrace firm, unshakable. The smell of laundry soap clung to her dress. For a long moment, he felt like a child again, shielded from the noise of the world. Her voice was quiet, but it pierced through everything. Now you know you can. The boy's throat closed. He pressed his face into her shoulder, the tears he had fought all evening finally breaking free. Not from humiliation, not from shame, this time from something else. Relief. Belief. A door had opened inside him, and he knew it would never shut again. Around them, the theater began to empty, the last echoes of applause fading into murmurs of conversation. A few people glanced his way with hesitant smiles, as though unsure whether to approach, but he no longer needed their validation. That night became the turning point. He didn't know it then, not fully, but the memory of the jeers and the miracle that followed would harden into something indestructible. Years later, when he stood on stages far larger than this battered theater, when his name traveled farther than the small streets of his childhood, he would remember. Not the applause, not even the duet, but the way Elvis had looked at him and said, "You sang it honest." The Cadillac's hum was long gone. The theater lights dimmed one by one. Outside, the summer air smelled of warm asphalt and distant honeysuckle. Life looked ordinary again, people leaving in groups, cars starting, voices drifting into the night. But for the boy and his mother, standing together in the quiet aftermath, the night was no longer ordinary. It was the night when disgrace had been broken, when a legend had stepped from the shadows, when a voice nearly silenced had found its beginning. And as they walked out into the humid darkness, the boy realized that everything ahead of him would carry the echo of this night. Not as a wound, but as a promise.